So, Simon Calvert, looking at the experience of other countries, would you agree with Anne that this shifts the dial in terms of the dialogue that we have? It may not make changes immediately, but in the way that we view parenting going forward and the way future generations view parenting, physically punishing your child will just become a non-starter.
So in New Zealand, when they passed a ban, what we saw there, and it's documented, is parents being prosecuted, parents being investigated, parents having long-term social services involvement, parents losing contact with their children during that process. And what we also saw was that
can you give us some numbers on? Can you give us some numbers on that, Simon?
Yeah, we're talking low hundreds. And what we also saw in New Zealand was a referendum where the public voted by more than 80% to repeal the ban on smacking. But unfortunately, the politicians ignored it. And that's the problem we got in Scotland, is that politicians are ignoring public opinion. We know that public opinion is overwhelmingly against this. Polls routinely show about 70% oppose criminalising smacking. The Parliament held a consultation when the proportion of people who opposed the ban was even higher than that. We need a dose of reality here.
Well, also, we need to be very careful when we're quoting polls. I mean, we don't have the time in the phone in for me to ask you to give me your references, etc. on that. So I need to just say
but the Scottish Parliament had its own consultation, and 80% of individuals who responded didn't want the ban. And let's be clear, the current law protects reasonable chastisement, not unreasonable chastisement. So if a parent, the guidance says, does anything that leaves more than transient reddening of the skin, that's unreasonable, it's unlawful, and they can and should be prosecuted. So what Scottish politicians are planning to ban today
is still allowed, Simon.
Behaviour.
And that, Anne, is, I presume, where you would come in. What you favour is the situation whereby it is taken off the table, that we are all in agreement as a country that to hit a child is no more acceptable than to hit an adult. I mean, Simon, you know,
I need to come back on that, if I may, please, because it's very important to recognise that we are talking about criminalisation here. I know that Anne has been handed notes to say we're not, but if we're not criminalising parents, then why is the Scottish Parliament debating the prosecution policy? Clearly, we're talking about criminalising, and you know, we have to be fair here that. If you do that, if you criminalise a kind of parenting technique that many, many families use, 85% of people say they were smacked, then you have to expect that the police and the procurators fiscal will take the criminal law seriously and they will apply it. And you have to expect that social workers will as well. And that could lead to long-term social services involvement in families where there's nothing wrong whatsoever, except that mum once tapped a toddler on the back of the hand for doing something naughty.
One of the things that the legislation does is it draws an absolute equivalence between adults and children in the way that they should be treated. So if a work colleague of yours, for some vindictive reason, willfully broke your coffee cup, Simon, would you consider giving them a smack for it?
I wouldn't take away their mobile phone if I thought that they were abusing it, but when my children were young, and if there was problems, I could take away their mobile phone. If you have to recognise that the relationship between me and my colleagues, it's important because the relationship between me and my colleagues is not the same as my relationship with my children. And if you don't recognise the unique rights and responsibilities of parents in relation to their children, then you will get very confused. But if you recognise that parents do all kinds of things for their children to help raise them as good, responsible human beings, that you would never dream of doing for another adult. And so a mum might decide that with a toddler who can't be reasoned with any other way over a particular issue, she taps him on the back of the hand. That's her decision. You shouldn't bring the police and social services into that decision. You shouldn't be threatening to prosecute her. That's her decision.
I'm interested actually that you say a mum. I'm interested that you say a mum, because obviously that would apply to any parent, wouldn't it?
Well, indeed. Well, a dad too. That's right. And so any parent, again, if you don't recognise that parents have rights and responsibilities, it's a different vision, though, isn't it? A big bloke smacking a 2-year-old. It creates a different vision in your head, doesn't it? Well, look.
Does it not?
I'm 5'10". When my children are both adults. When they were toddlers, there was an occasion where I tapped one of my children on the behind for doing something wrong. should I have been prosecuted for that? Would their childhood have been better if I'd been holed up in front of the police for doing that?
That's the question, Anne, isn't it?
If I'd been
can I put that to Anne? Simon, can I put that to Anne? Because you've been very honest in saying that, that there were occasions in your children's youth that you would have tapped them, as you say.
Yeah.
Should he have been criminalised, Anne?
He should definitely call himself into account for the fact that he hit his children, in my opinion. I would also just add, I take exception to the implication that I was handed notes, Simon. I'm speaking as a mum of 3 living down the road from the BBC here in Govan. I'm not speaking as anyone else. And so the words that are coming out aren't from notes, they're from myself and my own notes. But I think violence is wrong. A toddler does not understand anything other than the fact a smack hits. They don't understand why they were hit. They just understand that it hurts. And to actually be sitting here and defending hitting your children is actually preposterous to me. I can't believe in this day and age that anybody would defend.
And that's your view, but you're not entitled to use the criminal law to enforce your view. And that's what we're talking about. Parents who take a different view to you, good parents who love their kids, who hug them, who use positive affirmation, who use the naughty step, who use all kinds of parenting techniques that you would approve of. Also, some of them will occasionally judge in a dispassionate way that this is a situation where I need to tap my toddler on the back of the legs. Your approach would be to criminalise them for that, and that is grossly unfair. And I think this, I point the finger of blame at the politicians. They must be so far out of touch with ordinary life to think that this is a positive thing. How are the police and the social services, whose job it is to identify kids who are at risk, meant to cope?